So we're going to do a short video today on caster shallow fishing. We're fishing at Rookery waters. Obviously it's a venue that I know fairly well, seeing as my tackle shop is at the fishery. It's a fishery that I've been involved with since I was 7 or 8 years old. It's now been here probably 20 years. Well, the original lake was dug 20 years ago, and I've been here full time with the tackle shop probably about 4.5 years. Probably, wow, 4.5 years, that quick already. So originally it started off with the Rook Lake, which is the big one at the top, and that was stocked with carp. I think about 5,000 carp went in there to start off with. Then my auntie decided to dig another one, which was magpie. So I think that opened up in 2003, 2004. That's a beautiful lake. That's got 36 pegs, and it's absolutely heaving with fish. As you'll see, we're on Raven today, which is the newest of the lakes, but it's probably 5 years old. We probably opened this lake up same time as the tackle shop and everything was done, and the cafe. So for a lake that's 5 years old, it's really mature. Lots of trees. So the lake that was dug third is J Lake, and that's a big lake, to be honest. It's probably the biggest out of all of them. You don't tend to get as big a weight, but it's probably one of the fairest lakes on the complex. Lots of carp, a few F1s. But this method we're going to use today works on all of the lakes at Rookery. As soon as the fish have finished spawning, they go on a bit of a munch. Caster shallow, a few little tricks that I use and a lot of the local match anglers use. There's another one there. So we're on Raven Lake. It's standard canal style lake, sort of 14.5 metres across. Goes to about 8 foot in the middle. It's silted up a bit now. It's amazing how these snake lakes silt up, really. They, especially down the middle, because that's where it all goes. But we're actually fishing in the top 2 foot of the water today, and we're targeting the F1s and carp if they come in probably a bit later on. I'm using casters, and the reason why we use casters for shallow is everything loves them, so you're not selective in what fish you're trying to catch, and you can be really aggressive. I think the noise when the fish are feeding on the casters brings in other fish, and they make the right noise when they hit the water, and they're just, oh, that's a better carp, that one. I said we'll get a bit of everything. Big long comment, and you can use casters on the hook, or worm heads, or maggots, whatever you prefer. But we're going to particularly be talking about banded caster fishing, which isn't a new thing. It's been about for a long time now, and just more importantly, the setup, how we're going to feed it in different scenarios. We've got a perfect day today for what we're trying to do, really. I'll just put that caster on the band. Right, the key thing with fishing shallow is all about the feeding. We're going to talk about caster shallow fishing today. I mean, we're going to be fishing banded caster. It's not a new method, but get it right and it's absolutely devastating, especially on commercial fisheries like here at Rookery. Once the fish have finished spawning, they go on a proper munch then, and they're looking for as much protein as they can, and casters are one of the best baits for them. So the key things really is feeding. How much to feed, when to feed, starving the fish on the hook almost, feeding whilst, there's no rig in the water, or feeding when your float is in the water. So little things can make big differences. We're going to go through some tips that make a difference. Obviously, length of line makes a big difference. So we'll start off with the rig. The rig we're using today is a 4x10 map island float. and it's got a little bit of a bristle because we are fishing for F1s predominantly and a few carp mixed in. If it was just F1s, it'd still use the same float pattern with a bristle so you can read your bites a bit easier. Whereas if it was carp, you'd tend to go for a more conventional sort of dibber style shallow float. Because it is so warm, lots of fishing with peg, I'll start off with the lines. So we're using 016 fluorocarbon main line. Most of the time you use fluorocarbon for hook lengths. And the reason why you'd use fluorocarbon is because it's stiff and direct. Well, what we're trying to do here with F1s, we're trying to hit every bite, and a stiffer line makes you hit more bites. I know it sounds silly, but in the long run, if it makes you hit 2 or 3 more bites in a session, it can be the difference between winning the match or coming second or third. So I use an 016 fluorocarbon, and then so unhook this little F1. Scored a job on that one. So 016 main line, and then we've got a light 012 hook length, and it's 4 inches. I don't like long hook lengths for F1 fishing, but that's, you know, you could use it shorter than that, a 2 inch as well. But today we're fishing 4 because there's quite a few carp in here. And then we've got a small size 18 B911 eyed, and it's the new Teflon coated ones. And the reason why we're using 911 ahead of perhaps a lighter hook is because of the carp in here. They're 2 to 4 pound and they do pull a bit, so you want to give ourselves a chance of getting them in. And we've got a band which is tied directly to the back of the hook, just on, so your caster is really close to the hook. Because these F1s are really shy biting fish, you want to be as direct as possible, hit more bites. Now the band is critical as well. Obviously casters are pretty general size. Obviously some caster maggots are bigger than others, but as a rule of thumb I use a clear latex MVR Maver bait band, and they're absolutely perfect. You'll notice that I'm not putting the band on with any tool. I can just put it on nice and normal, and it's nice and fast. Because when you're fishing for these small F1s, you need probably say 100 on here for 160 pound, which that's the sort of target weight you're looking for. Right, so sometimes you'll catch 2 or 3 fish on one particular caster. The other advantage of using a banded caster is if there is any silverfish in your peg, they tend to ignore it, or they can't get at it, they don't crush your bait. So that's another advantage. Right, we'll talk about casters themselves. The fresher the caster the better, obviously. One of the things doing this, you need a large volume of bait. I mean, you could perhaps get away with 3 pints, but you really need 6 to 8 pints to have enough for a 6-hour match. You're feeding constantly all the time and you get through it. Some days you feed more than others. Sometimes big handful before you go out and then slap your rig over 2 or 3 times pays dividends. Another time just literally 2 or 3 casters and try and keep them as tight as possible. So each day is different. I tend to find when you're fishing for carp, bigger handfuls and fishing them out are more effective. Just for a simple fact that they feed differently to an F1. F1s come up regularly, sort of come up and down, and intercept the bait really fast, whereas a carp tends to come in and sort of hover at that depth and just move around in your peg and mop up as many as they can as quick as they can. So a little bit of both today. Ooh. F1, as you can see, a nice £1.5 size F1s, perfect bait builders. So all I'm going to do pick a nice dark caster as well. I mean, if you was roach fishing, you'd choose a dark caster, nice and crispy. And the same for F1s really. I think a darker hook bait is more visual when they're looking upwards than perhaps a lighter one. Just put that on the band. Right, what we're going to do, we're going to feed about 40 casters as accurately and as tight as you can. Just going to ship out and get to the chosen point. We're just going to flick the rig over just to imitate casters hitting the water 2 or 3 times, sometimes 4, and keep as tight a line as you physically can. Obviously depends on the wind as well and what size rig you're using. There's a bite, missed that straight away. I haven't fed yet because I want to try and sort of starve the fish onto the hook, sort of push them towards my hook bait rather than a load of loose offerings. So there's a lot of fish there. Just keep windmilling the rig over. Obviously certain fisheries have different rules on how shallow you can fish. At Rookery we haven't got a sort of a minimum depth between you can fish or length between float tip and your elastic. Venues that do have sort of a minimum depth, sort of about 18 or 12 inches, the fish can be really hard to catch sometimes because you can't get in the shallow enough to catch them because they're right up it, intercepting it real high up in the water. But at Pidley obviously we don't have that rule, so sometimes you can fish really, really shallow. That's why I'd probably have a smaller, shorter hook length, probably 3-inch hook length, so you can get that shallow without having no shot on your line. I mean, it depends really. I mean, 2 foot's a nice depth. If you can catch at 2 foot all day, you tend to catch them bigger F1s. Sometimes you tend to find the smaller F1s will come up shallower, being more aggressive on the casters. But it just depends, each day's different. So normally, if a venue's got a minimum depth you can fish at, then I'd probably start my session at that depth, because I know it sounds silly, most people start at 2 foot. I would start at that, and if I don't get bites, I just keep going deeper until I start getting bites. Whereas some people would probably start at 2 foot and then come shallow as they miss bites. So I tend to do it the opposite way around, just so I'm not missing out on any fish straight away. So yeah, 2 foot's a good depth. Today we're probably catching at about, I don't know, 8 inches deep, something like that. Really shallow. Fish are being aggressive. They're coming up for it, especially these F1s. Right, so we're not fishing far out today. We're fishing probably 7 or 8 metres out. The reason for that is we want to feed casters by hand, so everything's quicker. I can keep everything accurate as well. The noise of the casters when you throw them in is totally different. So we'll talk about setup first. So we've got a nice big roller, set quite high as well. I don't know whether it's me because I'm used to fishing the drains, and when you strike you tend to always ship up as if you're shipping up a bank, but I like to have my roller a little bit higher, so as I hook a fish I can just keep the pole, the bottom of the pole high, straight onto the roller, straight back into my pole sock. The other key thing is Dyer and other manufacturers as well, they do these short F1 kits or shallow kits, perfect for canal lakes. They stiffen your pole up. If I just show you a length of a normal one, they're not that much. I mean, that is a shorter kit from Dyer anyway, but they're not that much shorter, but they transform your pole. It's a bit like a short 4. When you put a short 4 in your pole, it just stiffens your pole up, strengthens your pole up. They're very strong as well. I probably wouldn't recommend them fishing for 10-pound carp with a big purple hydro through, but for this sort of fishing today, I've opted for the 4mm version. Now they do a 4mm and a 4.7. Normally, 9 times out of 10, I'd probably use a 4.7, but I've got an orange hydro elastic in today, which is classed as an F1 grade of elastic. Through the 4mm kit, it runs perfectly. No need to go to a 4.7. excuse me, any elastic heavier than that, then I'd fish a 4.7. So up to an orange hydro, I'd use the 4 mils, and then above that, sort of your whites, greys, blacks, I'd use a 4.7 mil. As you've probably noticed already, the colour of the top kit. I'm a bit undecided at the minute. I'm a great believer in, if it gives you confidence, then to use it. To me, whether I had a black standard short kit or a grey ghost cloud one, it wouldn't make any difference. But some people, they believe that this colour, the fish see them less. And when you're fishing short lines directly over the top of the fish, it makes a big difference. So if it works for the top boys, then it's going to work for me. So that's the top kits. Obviously we've got the new interelastic kit, puller fitted there. So if we do hook a bit bigger fish, we can shorten the elastic and get them in. The other advantage of using these short kits is, as you'll probably see when I'm netting fish in the video, when you comes to net fish, the fish are here, shorter. They're here sort of thing, rather than out here and you've got a pole everywhere and you know, you're chasing the fish around. Everything's nice and smooth, it's in the net, straight back. The other thing is, while I've got the landing net out, is landing net choice. Some venues, obviously you have to use commercial or fishery landing nets. Here at Rookery you can use your own. Now I've opted for the ends-on, smallest ends-on landing net head that is called pellet mesh. The reason why I like it is it's nice and shallow, especially for F1s. What you don't want is a deep landing net and you're burying trying to pick a small F1 and they're thrashing around in the net. The least amount of time they're in the net, the least they're going to not get caught in this fine mesh and straight back out and fishing again. The other thing is roller. We've talked about roller, nice and efficient. Everything's round me, top kit's round me, everything's to hand. So they're the key little pointers I find when you're fishing shallow, just to make everything a bit smoother, a bit more fine-tuned, as to say. So that's the setup. Now, we spoke about elastic, orange hydro, nice and soft and forgiving, but it's got a bit of power in it as well. Because it's only through a short kit, it soon powers up quick, so when you come to netting fish, it's nice and easy. So we're going to talk about rig. Now, I don't normally use fluorocarbon as a main line, as a rule of thumb, but for shallow fishing I do. And the reason why I use it for the same purposes you use it as hook length really, for feeder fishing, is the stiffness. So this is 016 fluorocarbon main line, and then we've obviously got the float. And this is a little bit different, this rig. This is the rig I use when I'm fishing really shallow, when the fish are right competing in the top levels of the water. You can see we're fishing very shallow. What's that, six inches deep, I suppose. Now, these black rubbers here, you'd think they may be a little bit bulky and a little bit clumsy, but they're actually tungsten loaded tubing. Now, what that does is it weights the float. So I have no shot down the line. I don't have no shot here. It gets less tangles. Obviously with the fluorocarbon line as well, you get less tangles. So everything's nice and direct to the fish. As you can see, you got the banded caster there with the hook on. So that's the rig I'd use when the fish are really competing high up in the water. Plus there's less resistance for the fish to take. Sometimes you need some shot on your rig just for the fish to hook themselves against. So that's the real shallow rig. Now the next rig I'll just put that there, is exactly that. So this rig, if they're more prone to the noise, I'll just put that rig on there now. As you can see, you got the hair rig with the band, and like I said earlier, the bands are the latex MVR mini bands, and they're absolutely perfect for casters. They don't stretch too much, they're not squashing the caster, so they're fantastic for that job. 012 hook length, which is TDR or tournament rig line. I do use it for my commercial hook lengths. It's perfect for that. Then we've got a small bulk of shot, and then we've got a 0.3 Drennan crystal dibber. Now, I've always used dibber floats. You tend to use this float more when you're fishing for carp. It's a bit more buoyant if you're fishing a bigger bait. But with more F1s, you tend to use a bristle float, like the map one I had earlier. Again, same elastic, same setup. A little bit longer line as well. so you can flick your rig over and make a bit of noise. And I would say that depth there that it's set at now, if you say your depth of your seat box, if you can catch at that, that's normally the best depth all day, because the fish don't get spooky. You tend to catch some better F1s at that depth, but when they're competing like they are today, then you'd be fishing right on top of your hook length. That's when the other rig comes into play, because there's less shot on your line, everything's lighter and a bit more direct. But again, that's 016 main line. In the summer you may want to go up to 018 if you're on a few better fish. So next thing we're going to talk about is, obviously we spoke about depth and stuff like that, is feeding. So I'll just put this away, out of the way. Actually, before we go on to feeding, we'll just talk about the terminal tackle side of things. So I'll just get this out here. We're going to talk about rigs. So we've talked about how we set them up and what lines and stuff like that. The bait bands for the rigs are the MVR latex bait bands in the mini size. You know, you don't have to use a bait band. You can just push them straight over the caster and they stay on perfectly. Hook lengths, you got the tournament rig line. If I was predominantly just fishing for F1s, I'd be using 012, but if it was an odd chance of a few better carp, I'd be on 014. Hook length tends to be either 3" or 4". Some people use smaller than that, but I reckon 3" is about as short as I'll go for the shallow fishing. Hook wise, if it was predominantly just F1s, I'd go with the Gamakatsu Power Carp riggers, but the lighter version. They're really sharp, they've got an outturned eye, and they're just absolutely perfect for fishing for F1s, a nice and fine hook. And then for a bit of mixture of everything, I'd go for the old faithful B911, but these are the T911, so they're Teflon coated, they don't rust, and they're brilliant. Then if I was fishing for more predominantly carp, say I was on Magpie, where you're looking for bigger weights, probably an 016 hook length, I'd use the Power Carp light rig. It's only a small hook. Obviously you don't want a too big a hook when you're fishing shallow. It's all about balancing your bait out. And then we've covered the rigs there. So that's it terminal tackle wise. So, casters, brilliant bait. Why do we choose casters? Well, I think the key thing that the fish love is noise. Obviously they're looking for food, so any noise attractant helps. I think other fish feeding on the casters, I don't know if we can get any footage at all, or sound footage of some fish feeding on casters, but I think other fish feeding, crunching, brings other fish in as well. They just, when the fish have finished spawning, all they want to do is eat protein, and worms and casters are brilliant hook baits. Especially the hotter it is, the better they work, to be honest. You can be aggressive with casters as well. You know, some people are really negative and feed small amounts of casters, whereas if you were fishing for carp, say for magpie, you'd be feeding big handfuls like that, because carp feed differently to F1s. They come in more and stay at the depth and hover and move around, whereas with F1s, sometimes it's all about feeding while you're playing a fish, and then when your rig's in the water, trying to home them into taking your hook bait. So you tend to feed 3 or 4 times whilst you're playing a fish, maybe, or say as soon as you hook a fish, you feed in some casters. Probably normally when I hook a fish, I tend to feed a few more than I would normally, just for the noise factor, to bring the fish back in to where they are, because obviously the fish you've hooked spooking them and spooking the rest of the shoal. Then straight back to your top kit. Tend to take the top kit off, then feed again. Then you obviously assess whether the fish is ready for netting or not. If it's not, I tend to feed again. Then I net the fish, put the fish into my lap, and then I feed again. Sometimes I'd feed again before shipping out, so that when I put my rig in, my hook bait's the only one there. So that's one of the key things that sets a lot of anglers apart, is feeding when you're fishing shallow. You know, everyone can just keep chucking bait in, but it's all about getting the bites on the hook, and getting the fish lined up. Similar to squat fishing on the drains or any squat fishing, it's all about, once you've hooked that fish, it's all about feeding for the next one. So sometimes what you tend to find as well is, if say you hook a bigger fish, or your peg's just starting to die on you, maybe just taking a little bit longer to net the fish and feed a bit more before going out again. It just gives your you're lying a little bit of a rest before going back out there, and then the fishing's back up to speed again. So the other thing is just constantly feeding and working out what the fish want on the day. Every day is different. If you were fishing at 2 foot, say, you'd probably be feeding less. I tend to find if you were fishing pellets, you'd catch best at 2 foot because they're slightly heavier and they sink a bit quicker. That's the optimum depth. Whereas with casters, the shallower the better. The shallower you can get, the more bites you'll get and the quicker you'll catch them. The other change hook bait I would use sometimes if I was probably fishing for more carp is a worm hook bait. Some people put a head on the hook, probably that sort of size bit of, just nip the head off there like that, so it sinks nice and slow. Again, you could either quick stop it on or you could put it straight on the hook, but I think quick stop works really well because you can catch 3 or 4 fish, maybe more than that, on the same worm. So they're the hook bait. Sometimes maggots is good. A banded maggot sinks very slowly, like a dead maggot, just falls through the water just a little bit slower and just catches them warier fish. Talking about casters themselves, obviously if you're roach fishing, the fresher the better as a rule of thumb, whereas if you're commercial fishing, I think as long as you've got some decent crispy ones for the hook, you know, if you look after them, if you've got some left, just put them in the fridge and they can last quite a while. As long as you give them a good wash so they don't smell that bad and off. But these fish, when they're competing for it, they're not worried about whether they're 5 weeks old or done today. So just a good decent caster as well. And the other thing is, you need large quantities. I mean, this is excessive. I've just bought the kitchen sink literally full of casters just for today, but as a rule of thumb, 4 to 6 pints. I like to be aggressive with my feeding, so I'd take a gallon, which is 8 pints of casters to my peg in the summer. Whether you're fishing just the one line, if you were fishing 2 lines, you know, if you wanted to fit a line in down the edge, you'd probably need a bit more, but it's just a nice way of fishing and effective as well.